Jewish law is very clear that every single person has an obligation for tzedakah. And specifically, every person has an obligation to give between 10 and 20% of their income for tzedakah. So 10 is the minimum, and 20 is generally the maximum, because there's a fear that somebody might become so generous that they'll give away all of their income or too much of their income to tzedakah, and they'll find themselves dependent on public support themselves. So 20 is usually the maximum, so though there are exceptions for extremely rich individuals or for people giving away all of their money at the end of their life. The interesting thing about this requirement is it's a requirement for everybody. So even somebody who is him or herself taking from the tzedakah funds is required also to give. And this confers, I think, a bit of dignity on the person who's giving as well as taking, so that somebody who's taking doesn't feel like he or she is always just taking and always dependent on everybody else, but also has something to contribute. When I was in Chicago, I did some work with day laborers in the northwest corner of Chicago. It was a group of men, mostly from Mexico and some other parts of Latin America, who would stand on the corner of the street every morning looking for work and would end up working for not very much money when they could find work. They were always struggling. Sometimes they would get a job and they wouldn't get paid at the end of the day, or sometimes they would get a job, they would be driven out to some suburb, they'd just be left there. Sometimes they'd stand on the corner and they wouldn't get work for days and days. They were really just struggling to get by. And one of the most amazing things that I saw in my time that I spent with them was that another group of Latino workers, a group of migrant workers who worked on picking tomato plants, came to speak to this group about their own experience. And migrant workers are in an even worse situation than day laborers. They're earning less money, they're exposed to all sorts of pesticides and other chemicals. The tomato workers showed that their hands would get stained red, not from the tomato juice, but from the chemicals that were sprayed on the tomatoes that would burn their hands. And they have a very difficult time organizing. They're not covered by most labor laws in this country. And the amazing thing that happened was these day laborers who had almost nothing opened their pockets and just started giving money to the migrant workers. This was an example of people who they weren't dependent on public tzedakah funds because they weren't collecting any public money. They weren't eligible for any public money, but they were certainly people who were eligible for private tzedakah. And yet they were opening their pockets to people who were in an even worse position than they were. And that was the best example that I've ever seen of the importance of somebody who's taking or who potentially could take also being able to live as givers and to think of themselves as givers and not only takers.